I'm Heather Harpham, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Heather Harpham.
It's episode 240 of the Author Stories Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Find all the archives of the show at hankgarner.com, and there are links there where you can subscribe to the show so that you never miss an episode. I'd like to thank some sponsors today for making this show possible. If you would like to sponsor the show, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a link in the top menu bar where you can click to find out how you can advertise on the show to bring more quality content. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned is my very favorite monthly publication. This is pulp goodness like you remember from when you were a kid in some of those great magazines. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, the Halloween special is out right now. Go pick it up today. Bob Williams' series, Blood and Chaos, which combines Music City Macabre and Arch City Apocalypse. Music City will never be the same. If you ever wondered what would happen at the end of the world, well, now you can, through the lens of Nashville, Tennessee. Music City Macabre and Arch City Apocalypse, collected together as Blood and Chaos. ThirdScribe.com. Authors, you need a website. You've heard me say it time and time again. And readers, if you'd like to connect with your favorite authors, go to ThirdScribe.com. Rob and the folks there have built a community that links readers and writers in a brand new, fresh way. You're going to love it. Go check out ThirdScribe.com today. The Paragons Trilogy by C. Stephen Manley. When dark portals open, heroes will awaken. Israel and Aaron are strangers with an uncommon bond. Not only did they just wake up in an unfamiliar warehouse with no memories of how they got there, but they're also the next potential victims for a pack of hideous mutants. At least until a covert organization saves their lives and takes them to meet an eccentric billionaire. It turns out that Israel and Aaron have something in common with the heroes of ancient mythology as well. They share unique genetic remnants that both trigger superhuman abilities and attract a group of equally mutated doomsday cultists. You're going to love this series. If you like urban fantasy, you're going to love Awakened, book one of the Paragons trilogy. Go pick up the whole series now. Essence, Book 1 Septima by Nick Breaker. You've heard me talk about Nick Breaker's science fiction with the Galactic Satori Chronicles. Check out this brand new series that he started. Essence, the first book in a new sci-fi series by Nick Breaker, a coming-of-age tale full of adventure and steamy encounters. Go check out this book. You're going to love it. Nick is one of my favorite writers, and you're going to love this new series he started. The Ember War Saga by Richard Fox. Dragon Award winner Richard Fox. If you're looking for military sci-fi, this is some of the best you'll ever find. The Ember War by Richard Fox. 9 books are available now. If you're looking for a new series to get into but don't want to wait on the author to catch up to you, go pick this up now. Richard Fox. Thanks to my friends at Keystroke Medium, one of the best writing shows on YouTube. They have a live show every Monday. Go visit them now. See the link in the show notes, Keystroke Medium. As always, at the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to bring you a conversation with Heather Harpham. Heather is the author of the new book, Happiness, a Memoir. Welcome to the show, Heather.
Thank you, Hank. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so happy that you are. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I know that you start each show with that question because I was just listening to your interview with Fiona Davis.
Oh, I love Fiona.
Oh, it was a beautiful interview. And I really related to so much of what she had to say because I also have a background as I wouldn't quite say an actress, but a performer and somebody with a deep love for theater. And so that the sort of two streams of storytelling, the performing and the writing are something I really related to. And I loved her answer about, being young and kind of coming to storytelling that way through being an actress age. What I remember, what sprung into my mind when I heard you ask that was that when I was in camp, summer camp as a kid. At the end of the session, they gave out awards. Like every kid got an award for something.
Sure.
And it was a very egalitarian award system. And the award that I got was Best Raconteur. And at the time, I didn't even know what that word meant. But I was delighted to figure out that it meant storyteller. And I had, in fact, told this really terrifying ghost story to my cabin. And I guess it stuck in people's minds because I got that. But it did make me think about how important story was to me as a kid and to most of us. It's the foundational level of imagination where other characters spring to life. And I grew up with my parents separated. So my dad was a weekend dad, and he would drive me back to my mom's every Sunday night. And every drive home, he spent telling me stories, often the same couple of stories over and over again, because I love them and would request them. So I think that love for story and storytelling started very early for most of us. Yeah. And definitely for me.
I agree. For most of us, I have a theory that that storytellers are born and writers are made. That there's something in us that wants to communicate, through metaphor and through, all of these made up situations that really get to the root of who we are. But make them more palatable and let our guard down and tell these things about us.
Right.
And then the writing is the kind of the mechanics around that allow us to communicate that to a broader audience. But it's all at its heart is the storytelling aspect.
Yeah. And what you just said is so true. It's metaphor. It's the valence of imagination dropped between, reality and, I don't know, archetype or something. Yeah. And that's why so many kids' stories are peopled by animals.
That's right.
And there's something very freeing when we take one step back, and it's not the exact thing, but it's the thing that stands for the thing. So I think metaphor is probably the most powerful tool we have after the wheel.
Yeah. Well, I'm silently shaking my head. Like, yes, I agree with you there, Heather. That's, you said that your dad would tell you stories in the car, going home. Did you come from an artistic family? Was this something that was intentional, or is this just kind of who you were as a family?
Well, my mom was quite artistic and still is. She was a photographer and a poet. She's a beautiful poet. And so she was always up to something creatively, and I was always witness to that as a kid. And I had a lot of admiration for all the many creative hats she could wear. My dad was an attorney, but probably should have been a history teacher. I mean, I think he would say the same. And I think what he loved in history was the story of how people organized themselves, who came to power, who fell from power. It's, for some historians, it's that deeply personal kind of narrative arc that hooks them. And so I grew up listening to my dad tell me, when I was little, imaginative stories, and later, details of like the Prussian Empire or something. But for him, it was very alive, very, very human and real.
Well, I think I'm friends with several attorneys. We have some in the family, and I think a lot of them went into the law because of the stories that they heard of, courtroom battles and things like that. And yes. The reality is there's a lot of downtime that's research and paperwork and
that's right.
all of that crap that is not glamorous whatsoever. But you do all that stuff to get to that one great story that you get to tell at a dinner party or something.
And there's also the possibility that you're going to change someone's story. I mean, my dad began his his law career as a real idealist. I don't think I can say he ended it that way. And that's, as much in a societal indictment as anything. But he began as a real idealist with a very deep commitment to the idea that everyone should have equal and equally skillful representation. And he became a defense attorney. And when, that means, on either side of defense or prosecution, you can change people's story, perhaps. So there was that. And then he was he was a terrific litigator. Like, he was quite performative in court. So I also remember going into court and listening to his closing or ending arguments. And that's a moment when you tell a story to a jury, right? This is my version of who this guy is or this woman is, and this is why they did what they did. And I think also watching him essentially perform those stories had a powerful effect. Yeah.
You said that you have a similar story to Fiona in that you're drawn to the performance arts. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in that and what that did for you in this being this young storyteller and how it helped you to express what was going on inside of you.
Sure. So when I was in high school, I mostly did theater, but I also loved writing. And then in college, those sort of twin loves continued. I loved writing and I loved acting, creative writing, fiction, and acting. And I went to a college where I could sort of straddle both. And then after college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do about graduate school. I mean, eventually you have to pick, right?
Yeah.
At least in theory. And
sadly.
Yes. Yep. And I ended up discovering this particular form of theater improvisation, which was a very sort of physical-based improvisation. And it wasn't like Second City. It wasn't sort of scenario-based. But it did, and so its aim wasn't comedy. So I found this form of physical improvisation called action theater. And that method of improvisation allowed you to spontaneously create a narrative, to use metaphor and sort of interwoven storylines to create a narrative spontaneously while performing. And this isn't something that's for everyone. It's not something that's going to make you instantly rich and famous or even, fill up your bread box, as it were. But it was an art form that allowed me to synthesize the love of writing and the love of performing. And I ultimately took it beyond improvisation and began to use the format to generate one-person shows, solo plays. And I've written 6 of those over about 20 years and performed them all around in universities and in regional theaters. And that's just been a joy to be able to create an evening-length piece that addresses a theme or a topic and can come at it from very different narrative strains or streams, if you will.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the improv format, especially where one actor is playing off of another actor, and you have the yes and kind of form of building the story together, and you never cancel out what the other actor says, but you build on it and becomes this new narrative. But what is it like doing a one-person show? That it would seem that would be very scary, but that's a whole other type of improv, I would imagine, where you are taking the audience along, and do you modify in the moment? Is it strictly a write ahead of time and then perform it to the letter, or is there room for improv when you're doing a one-person show?
Well, I took that improvisation form, action theater, and would use it in the studio to develop material. And that material I would set. So when I actually go to perform a solo piece, it's almost always following a script that I've written, but I've literally written it physically because I don't write for the theater at the computer. I write by doing, by improvising. I'm up. So the body is the engine, if you will, the narrative engine. And I do that because when you go to perform, physicality is everything, right? Such a different medium than communicating with the reader on the page. And yes, sometimes I will have, one particular section, like in the last piece I made, which was about just a light little comedic piece about climate change, called Burning. And, that piece has just gotten more and more fun to perform because you can inhabit it with all the kind of wild and woolly characters who are filling our cultural landscape right now. And at one point in that piece, I have a character who appears to me in a dream. So it's a dream, but he's the personification, this character, of an oil company. So he's a guy, but the way dreams can take on these alternate realities, he's also he's like the ultimate incarnation of corporate personhood. And that section, he's supposed to be drunk and kind of coming on to me in this bar and, seducing me, basically. And like, for instance, that section I leave open. I know what he sounds like. I know how he moves physically. I know that he's going to talk about these three different sort of talking points, but the actual way he poses each sentence and, the syntax of the moment, I leave open to improvisation.
Well, and he could be a movie mogul with today's headlines.
Oh, he could be just about so many people.
Yes. Oh, mercy. You say that you write these pieces physically. So
yes.
How do you notate this? How do you keep up with it? Are you videoing yourself?
It's hard as heck. I don't videotape myself because I found that I just bored to tears looking back. It's painful. If you're looking at yourself on video, why didn't I do this? This is so strange. And you're sort of looking at the experience from the outside. And that's the opposite of what my theater training has directed me to do, which is to be very deeply inside the lived experience, moment by moment by moment, beat by beat. So video transcription, I avoid. What I do is I get up and I'm doing, and maybe I'll do 3, 4, 5 minutes of material. Then I will run to the notebook, write down every phrase as precisely as I remember it. And I want often the wording to be absolutely precise because this kind of writing physically will produce a kind of unconscious poetry sometimes. And you really want the sound, the musicality, the particular rhythm of a phrase. And then I will also make these notations that are just like stick figures to remind myself of what I was doing physically.
I love that. I think a lot of more traditional writers, and by that I mean maybe novelists or nonfiction writers, people that strictly write. I think they could take clues and cues from maybe your style of working on your stage performances as well. I'm a big fan of people's processes and how it is that they go from the picture in their mind to the written word. And I'm a big fan of drawing things out on big sheets of paper and, working out scenes that way visually. Yeah. And a lot of times you can see things that you never would have come to just by writing out a scene, by visualizing that scene, then putting it on paper, and then thinking of all the ways to describe that and all of the language that would go to support that. I think opens up all kinds of possibilities.
That is fascinating. And I have never once heard anybody describe that, kind of linking visual art or visual depiction with writing process.
As I'm sitting here at my desk where I'm recording this, I have two giant posters above my desk, and what they are, our local newspaper will sell you these end rolls of newspaper paper that when they get down to the end of a run, there may be 50 or 60 feet left on these rolls, but it's not enough to run a new, series of papers. And you can buy these end rolls, and I'll take them and spread them out on my dining room table where they're just, 12 feet long or so. And I'll start at the left side, and I'll draw pictures, and I'll make notes, and I'll storyboard, a scene or an act of a book out like that. And then I tack them up here above my my desk, and I can visually see it from left to right as the story progresses.
That's beautiful. And it makes me think of a process that the theater director Anne Bogart describes. Again, we're back in theater, but certainly bringing stories alive, whether on the page or the stage, shares generative ground. And she takes her actors through this process. She's got a particular term for it, and I wish I could remember what it is right now. It's not something as simple as generation, but that's what it's about. It's about immersing yourself in the world of the play before you even begin to rehearse the play. And she has actors bring in just all kinds of things that they associate with the world that they're going to enter. If it's Victorian England, or if it's a futuristic vision on the North Pole, or if it's the Oval Office, she's having them collect and sort of scrapboard an environment full of association. And yeah, that reminds me of what you're describing.
That's awesome. So at what point did you start writing pieces that I know that you're working on the stage, but at what point did you decide
prose?
Prose. When did you start that?
Well, so I did, like I said, after college, I found this improvisation form, and I studied that for several years. Then I went off to grad school for theater, and I loved that. And as soon as I finished my master's, I realized I'd sort of educated myself into, a void, in that I had not gotten a terminal degree. I'd gotten an MA, and I really wanted to be able to teach. So I turned right around and went back to grad school in writing, partly simply because I was an employee of NYU, and I was working as what they called an actor teacher out in the public schools doing theater curriculum for kids about drug intervention and violence prevention. And so as an NYU employee, I could go to school for free. And I turned around and got an MFA in creative writing, which is something that I'd always sort of dreamed of being able to devote time to. And I finally could. So I, had written since I was young, but I really began to write in earnest then. And I was in the fiction track at NYU. And then I, really not long after I went to graduate school, I had, for the second time, and got that MFA in writing, I got pregnant and had a daughter and moved back to California and was on my own for a while. And I put writing to the side for a time. In the little bit, in the, the decade that followed, the little bit of energy that I had for creative life, I put back really towards writing for theater. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, when I decided that I was going to turn some of the material that I had approached theatrically about my daughter's illness and my relationship with my now husband, then partner, which was, we had a complicated journey to togetherness. I decided that I would approach that same material that I worked out as a solo play into a memoir. So that, the seeds of prose had been there all along, and they were there as a kind of foundation for me when I set out to write the memoir.
Heather, not everyone who becomes a writer gets an MFA. And that's that may be a news flash. But how do you think that affected your writing by going and getting that advanced degree?
Well, I first off, couldn't agree more. I mean, first of all, the MFA is a relatively new element in the writing world. I mean, the writers we adore through history certainly did not have MFAs, and many of them didn't have a lot of formal training. And nevertheless, they wrote their way into greatness. And I think probably most of them would talk about just the long, hard hours of looking for what they wanted until they hit the right voice, the right sentence, the right, novel by sheer attendance, as it were, in front of the keyboard, or the going back far enough, who knows what the very first stories were recorded on. So I certainly don't think it's any. I consider the MFA absolutely unnecessary to being a writer. But if you find it helpful to get that kind of concentrated, formalized feedback, and to have a kind of stake drawn around a particular time of your life in which you get to devote yourself to writing, then I think it's useful. I mean, it's an extreme luxury, and it doesn't make financial sense for a lot of people. Like I said, the reason I felt free to do it was because I was an NYU employee, and that degree was relatively very affordable to me. So I took it as the real gift and of time and attention that it was. And I happen to have a great community of fellow student writers and a wonderful, supportive community of professors. But all that feels like a very long time was over.
No. It sounds to me like the time and focus were the real gifts of that.
Absolutely.
Too. Because most people don't get that. We're juggling, 80 different things while trying to do this, and the learning of how it all works is such an integral part. And if you could set aside some time to do that, that sounds like an amazing gift.
It is an amazing gift. And I will also say, I think the number one way we learn to be strong writers is by reading and writing. I mean, that what develops your voice or your own aesthetic more than just reading and reading and reading and reading and exposing yourself to the beautiful river of other minds and imaginations and formulations, the way that people can be telling the exact same story in terms of circumstance, but come at it from such radically different aesthetics. And some aesthetics just reach right into us and rattle our bones. And that's wonderful. That's the beauty of art. So I think the way to hone yourself as a writer more than anything else is to stay alive as a reader.
Yes, absolutely. I know that you've written for some journals and magazines and things like that. What were some of the first prose pieces that you got published?
The very first thing I had published was the very first thing I had published was a short story that won a contest, and that was in Waterstone Review. And I was just so delighted because the editor who chose the story worked at Grey Wolf Press, which, is a small and very well thought of and very discerning, small literary press. And I was hopeful that maybe they would, since she liked that story, that maybe she would take the collection of stories that I had at that time, which didn't happen, but it was still one of those things that puts wind in your sails as a writer. It can be so hard and there are so many rejections. So you just savor the little puffs of wind that come along that keep you moving. And that was a big excitement for me early on. Later, I wrote several pieces for More magazine, which is sadly no more. But I was thrilled as a freelance writer to discover how well the glossy magazines paid. And that, when you're trying to contribute to keeping a family afloat or to keep your family afloat, if you're the sole provider, that's really a gift, and it's more and more rare. Things aren't remunerated as well, generally speaking, when you're writing on the internet. So having some access to the big glossy magazines financially was really helpful. And it's thrilling to feel like your work is sitting on a newsstand where anybody might happen upon it.
Right. You went on to write Happiness, a memoir, The Crooked Little Road to Semi-Ever After, and you alluded to the story that's in that book just a minute ago, and we're going to dive into this fantastic book in just a minute. But the pieces that you had printed in More and the various places were short pieces, and I think that short fiction and short essays. Thank you. I couldn't grab the word out of my head. I think those are really underappreciated in our market today, especially where, the novel rules and that sort of thing. And of course there are places where shorter pieces are highlighted and they still pay well. But there's, what was the creative process different in doing shorter pieces and then as opposed to the longer, the memoir that you wrote and the other pieces that you've written? Do you approach them differently? And
that's such a nice question. Thank you. I mean, first off, I love the shorter format. There's, for one thing, you get done. The book, me, if I'm speaking honestly, 5 years, and that's a long time to wait to be finished with something. And an essay could easily take me 5 weeks if I let it, but it's usually even shorter than that. It's an intense period of working over a short time, and I love it. It really, I feel like my whole brain is engaged, is sort of fired up. And you're making connections within a smaller space. Over the course of a book, a metaphor might sort of accumulate symbolism or meaning. You might return to it 100 pages apart, but within an essay, everything's compressed. I will not say that it requires the same rigor or artistry as a poem, because it doesn't. Essayists, you can send your hate mail to H. Harpham at, yeah. No, I mean, I think for most writers, many writers, poetry is a first love and a kind of an ultimate art. At least I feel that way. But it does share with poetry those both the invitations and the demands of compression.
Yeah, and the economy of words, needing to get your point across as tightly as you can, while making each word really resonate with deep meaning.
Yes, and you better know what you think, and you better have a way to say it, or you better be very clear that you're not sure what you think, and you better have an original way to talk about it. But you have to get on with it, and it's been interesting because I've had a piece about my relationship, my partnership, and how forgiveness works within a relationship that's experienced a significant rupture. And that piece was in a publication, a magazine in the UK called Red. And then I've had a piece about writing about my kids and the responsibilities and the potential pitfalls of writing about your children in Slate. And in both of those essays, which were written after the book, I found myself kind of realizing things on the page, discovering insights or just sort of a larger understanding of things that I almost wish I'd had when I'd written the book. This is material that I've been over and over and over in the 5 years of writing the memoir, but somehow that the action of trying to think about it all in a concise, tight, potent format brought a new light bulb, awake, kind of like bing, and now you see something new, you see it differently. So it's bittersweet. You can't go back and put anything into the book. It's done. But I really appreciated the opportunity to write essays.
Well, let's talk about the book for a moment. Happiness, a Memoir, The Crooked Little Road to Semi Ever After. This is a memoir which is a little different in approaching conversation about it, because you write the book after the thing has happened. So there's a whole story that then you go back and report on. And I know that's greatly oversimplifying the role of memoir. But first off, tell us a little bit about the setup for this experience that then became the book, and then we're going to get into a little bit about how the book came to be and the process around that.
Sure. And if you will forgive me, Hank, I'm going to take us very quickly through the story, because I think it's a joy to talk about writing and, all the things that go around it. So in short, as I mentioned, not long after graduate school, I was in a relationship with someone I was madly in love with, and vice versa. He was, we were madly in love with one another. He was a writer. He had no interest in having a family, never had made that clear. I only ever knew I would have a family, have kids, and that was something I absolutely had to have within a partnership. We were stumped on that. Then I got pregnant. We both stuck to what we said, and I went back to California to be near my family, where I, in fact, had my daughter, baby girl, who was very surprising to everyone, probably even herself, born sick. And she had a very severe blood disease, which presented at birth and left her dependent on blood transfusions in order to survive. So she could not sustain red cells in her body independently. She had to get blood. And as I've said, along the way, she was literally dependent on the kindness of strangers for her survival. Her illness meant that her dad and I were in constant contact, which we may well have been anyway after her birth. He met her when she was 4 months old. He fell as madly in love with her as I had, and as we had been with one another. And we began a long, sometimes painful, certainly complicated process of reconciliation, in the middle of which we had a second unexpected pregnancy, which was quite frightening, because the doctors had made clear to us that though a second child could cure our daughter if they were a match for her and she could have a bone marrow transplant with their donated stem cells, they couldn't give us odds on whether or not a new child would be born with the same disease that she had. And therefore, having another child risked having another sick child, which is the absolute last thing you want if you already have a very ill baby. So we were frightened and unsure of how to proceed, but went forward with this little soul who had arrived in our lives so unexpectedly. And he came into the world bearing first and foremost and always the gift of himself. His name is Gabriel, and our daughter's name is Amelia Grace. And miraculously, he was also a match for our daughter. So she was able to have, and he only had a 25% chance, a 1 in 4 chance of matching her. And he did. In fact, he wasn't just what they call a perfect match. He was, in which scenario, to be a perfect match, you need to match 6 out of 6 primary HLA markers. And he matched all 6 of those and then went on to match something like another 17. So he was extended match. And that meant that her body was able to accept his cells without it being a terrible strain on her. She wasn't fighting the donated cells. She accepted them essentially as her own. Going through a bone marrow transplant is not for the faint of heart. It's not even for the brave and hardy. It's really a difficult, painful process. Most of all, of course, for the patient. But for all of us who loved her, it was a scary, harrowing time. And, but she did it. She made it through, and she's now 16 and quite healthy. And our son is 14. So that's.
I'm getting a lump in my throat, Heather. This is an amazing story. I can only imagine what it must have been like for you and your family when this beautiful baby boy not only was born and, like you said, was the gift of himself, but that I was just, it's nothing short of miraculous.
It really felt and feels that way. I've come to have, in honesty, very ambivalent feelings about the concept of meant to be, because we went through a medical experience with other families and other children who did not survive and who just as deeply loved and prayed for and adored and cared for medically as our daughter was. And some things you don't get to understand. So I don't, at the end of the day, it's hard for me to sidle up beside that concept of her survival is meant to be, what about theirs? I don't know how to answer those questions, but it certainly feels miraculous.
Sure. We went through a similar, not even similar. We went through a thing last year with my youngest daughter who had a brain tumor and had a series of surgeries, and you're left with those feelings that even though she's perfectly fine and we had great outcomes and all of that, there's such a weight and a heaviness to it. That when you're on the other side of it, it's just humbling, And
can I ask how old she is, Hank?
She's 16.
Just the same age. And so she was sick as a young teenager.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think,
and all of the baggage that goes along with that.
Yes. Yeah. And she's healthy?
Yeah, she's great. She's doing fantastic now. But one thing that I noticed through that, Heather, is that I don't know if it's because of or in spite of the circumstances that are going on. Some of the very best art comes out of those situations, and those times, and some of the very best writing I've ever done came out of those nights where I sat up, where I couldn't sleep. And where I was dealing with the feelings of inadequacy, and someone whom I love so deeply is sitting here, and there's literally nothing I can do to fix the situation. We're getting the best medical care we can get and all of that stuff, but outside of that, there's absolutely nothing I can do. But what I can do is I can tell stories, and that grief and that anxiety and all of that stuff just really pours into that. And something transcendent happens when you take grief and you take these situations and allow them to breed something else.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to something very, very true and universal, which is that in these very high stakes moments when we are our most frightened, when the person we love, when a child, especially for a parent's life, is on the line, you're awake. You are wide awake. You may be awake with terror or with anguish, but you're awake. And that's a gift, because we're not always that awake in our daily lives. A gift is a strange word, but I do think that there's some part of it which fits, and that you then give whatever you can. So, like you're saying, you can give storytelling. I know in our case, when our daughter was really miserable, my husband would sometimes tell her a story. And going back to our comments about children's literature and animals, the stories he told her a lot of when she was at her sickest, and she was about 3.5 when she had her bone marrow transplant, featured ants. He would tell her these stories about this tribe of kind of anarchist ants. And she just loved these stories. And they would take her out of her pain, not permanently, but they would take her out of the hospital room and out of the immediate moment and let her dwell somewhere else for a few minutes. And that's, it's one of the few things we can do for each other.
That's right. Oh man. So this story goes on. There ultimately is good news for your daughter. But this book has so many layers. Not only is it a story about your relationship with your daughter and her trials and tribulations, but it's also a story about a family that's put back together. When your son was born, how did the story of your family progress? At
rocket speed. Sometimes it felt like when we were coming apart, it happened in slow motion. We were both in a state of real anguish, I think, and grief when we were separated during my pregnancy. And that time just drug on. And as soon as Gracie was born and born sick, things accelerated enormously. And that included, Brian and I's reunion. It took time and it was complicated. And certainly Gabriel was, fuel in the engine of our reunion. We did the best we could. All these things were happening at once. We had a sick kid. Then suddenly we had a second kid. And that meant we had a toddler daughter and an infant son. And Brian had to work. At first, I was still living in California with the kids, and he was there with me for a period of time. And then he had to go back to work. So he was commuting between New York and California. And then we all managed to get ourselves together on the East Coast in Brooklyn for 1 year. And then suddenly we had to go to Durham, North Carolina for Gracie's bone marrow transplant. Brian got to be there for a time. And then again, he had to go back to work. We had to keep our health insurance, much less, keep the lights on and food on the table. So he was commuting back and forth from now Durham, North Carolina, where Duke Medical Center was, and New York City, where his teaching obligations were. And I was in Durham with, again, a sick toddler and a semi-infant now. He was, 1 and change. So we were scrambling just to get through daily life, to make what we thought were the best medical decisions for our daughter. We had just agonized over whether or not to give her the bone marrow transplant, because though we knew it could be curative, it could also kill her. And that's just the facts. It's got a high mortality rate, pediatric bone marrow transplant, and you have to be willing to accept that if you're going to go for the cure. It's like reaching for the golden ring on the carousel pony. You got to lean way out to get the ring, and you could fall. You don't know. You don't get to know ahead of time. So those were the realms that we were co-occupying, making medical decisions for our daughter, trying to keep both kids fed and essentially tended to, our strong suit as parents, and take as good of care of one another as we could in the nooks and crannies around that.
So where did the idea to write this story come from?
Well, as I mentioned, I wrote it first in theatrical form as a one-woman show, but that was a much smaller view of the story. It had none of the material about Brian and I's relationship, and it actually dwelt quite a bit more on other families we went through the experience with, and on kind of the philosophical questions that had arisen for me from watching kids suffer, innocents suffer, and in some cases die to have a very shortened life. And kind of trying to come to grips with that. What does it mean? How do we live with a world that can feel arbitrary in its wounds? So that was the scope of the piece. Even with the piece, I didn't really want to make a performance piece about this material. Like, we just lived it. I would have been happy to. I thought I was going to make a performance piece about the body in a very general way, a kind of, what are the fragilities and the resiliences of the body? And this material kind of kept intruding on that, and I finally let it in. The book, I think I always hoped that I would try to tell this story in memoir form. But I didn't know if I'd be able to. It seemed like something so much bigger in scope than I'd ever attempted as a writer. So I just thought I would try and see how it went, kind of stage by stage. I had a lot of notes to turn to because when our daughter was sick and going through transplant, I had kept a kind of blog, really, that was keeping people updated, family and friends, with how she was doing. I had this fantasy that I'd just be able to turn the blog into a book, and that didn't work at all. I don't even know if there's one full sentence that's in the blog that's in the book. They're just totally different animals. It's a different kind of writing with a different aim and much less attention on language, certainly. I mean, I was just writing kind of in the way you talked about writing when your daughter was sick. I mean, I got the feeling that maybe that was creative writing, but I was sort of had that same sense that you talked about being fueled by this rush of feeling. But I was mostly just writing to communicate what was happening, day by day, beat by beat. And the kind of craft that needs to come into play in telling a long story and ordering that story. What are you going to tell when and how? What do you reveal to the reader now and then? That didn't happen until much later, when I began to really sit down and say, now I'm going to write the memoir. And even then, like I said, I just took it kind of month by month, year by year. I didn't know for sure that I would finish the book until I was over halfway done. I mean, I think some people have amazing resolve and they sit down to begin a book and they know they're going to get there. They know they're going to finish. And that wasn't the case for me. I just kept hoping until I reached a kind of tipping point. And then I thought, it's like 2/3 of the way there. Come on, I've got to go the last leg. But yeah.
How do you decide early on in the memoir process what the narrative thread is going to be? When you're writing memoir, it's not a blow by blow of your daily activities. Yes, it's your real life occurrence, but there's a narrative thread through there that carries the reader. And at what point in the process do you identify, okay, this is the story? This is what's really going to engage people, and this is where I'm going to steer the reader through. Like, is that
right
early in the process, or is that part of writing until you find it? What was that like for you?
Well, I think if you're lucky, you identify the most powerful or potent narrative threads early on, and you follow them throughout. For most of us, I think it takes some writing to get there. For me, like I said, I originally thought I would turn this blog writing into the book, and the first way in which that was just a total illusion became the first way in which the fact that was an illusion or a fantasy became obvious to me was that none of the story of Brian and I's relationship was in the blog. How would it be? It was just about Gracie's kind of, here are her blood counts today. So when I set out to write the book, I do remember that I had the first sentence in mind, and it had been there for a while. And that was, I don't know if I can bring it perfectly to mind, but essentially my first child, my daughter, was born perfect on a Thursday in early spring. Something like that is what the final version is in the book. And so I knew I was beginning with her and her birth. But it also became clear to me very quickly that any child, the birth of any child, invokes the question of their creation. And of course, of the love story that's usually, not always, but often, the backstory to this birth. So ultimately, I became conscious of three primary threads in the book. I was telling a story of maternal love, and that included my love for my daughter and also my love and appreciation for my mother and hers for me and for her first grandchild, my daughter. And then I was telling a story of romantic love, erotic love, between myself and my baby's daddy and now my husband. And that was a very complicated story with lots of, that's sort of where the subtitle comes from, The Crooked Little Road to Semi-Ever After, because no love story, I think, is ever, you hope forever after, but you get there one day at a time. So I think that's something to be conscious of. And then lastly, I wanted to tell a story of kind of community love and friendship. And we were carried across, the absolute roughest waters of our lives. And I was, in particular, by a close group of female friends, and ultimately by a kind of wider community who came and rallied around us when Gracie really was at her sickest. So I had these three love stories in mind, maternal love and romantic love, friendship love, or community love. The Greeks have all these great words for love, and I can't get them all right now. But yeah, that's what those are the threads I was following.
Heather, one interesting thing about memoir is usually it involves a cast of characters, and in your book, obviously, one of those narrative threads is about your daughter. So she's a character in the book, and then your son is a character, and your husband is a character, and then your cast of friends and family that fill it out. When writing memoir, because the cast of characters are real people, are there certain precautions that you take to protect people, or do you ask people before you include them? Kind of, what are some of the landmines that you have to watch out for when writing memoir?
Well, yes to both your questions. Yes, I think there are precautions you take to protect people, and yes, I think you seek permission where that's feels appropriate, and you err on the side of asking when you don't know. Landmines are everywhere.
Right.
In our case, I've written a lot about what it was like to portray my kids after the fact. So I've written a Slate article about that, and I've talked about it in some other arenas. It's very tricky. What I ultimately decided was that I had the right to describe them as I remembered them, as their mother. And I was writing about a version of them that, for the most part, is outside their own memories. It was the very early selves. They do not, and they've made this abundantly clear, want to be described now as they are as young adults. And I've learning how to respect that and negotiate that with them. In the Slate piece, I did describe them a little bit as who they are and how they are now. And I showed them to that piece before it was published and gave them the right to change anything or kill any line. I mean, I didn't give them the right. They have the right. And I said, exercise it as you will. So that's how I handled the kids. With the kids also, I never ascribed dialogue to them unless I'd had it written down really precisely. I did not want to put words in their mouth. I think that first of all, you sound like an idiot most of the time if you're trying, unless you're, I don't know who you need to be, what level of genius, like James Joycean genius, to invent dialogue for a child that will sound realistic, because kids speak in such idiosyncratic ways. So I wouldn't want to attempt it as an artist. And as a parent, I just don't think it's right. I wanted to bring them alive as who they were. And so I kept to that kind of boundary of only including language for them when I had notes, when I had written down what they'd said, sort of verbatim. With my partner, with Brian, he read the book. We sat there shoulder to shoulder until we were equally satisfied with the way he was portrayed and the way our relationship was portrayed. Or if not equally satisfied, like both feeling okay about it. When you're the storyteller, you have this power as the narrator. And so it was very important to me that I exercised that power in a way that ended up with a portrait of Brian that he felt comfortable with and that did him justice. It did his point of view justice, that his way of feeling and thinking through very difficult scenarios and decisions was, represented as accurately as possible. So he looked at it all, and sometimes we would wrangle over, things at the level of the sentence or even the level of the word until it felt right. And then with other people, with friends, I didn't, my closest friends who I write about in the book, I didn't have anything. I didn't think there was anything I wrote about them that would be objectionable, and they were fine with it. I mean, I'm for the most part in the book describing things that they lived through and remember, and events that we shared together. And there's, these were moments where they were coming to my aid and our family's aid and offering support in the most profound, beautiful ways. So I'm really talking about them in some of their most loving, generous moments, and they didn't stand in my way. I appreciate letting me do that. And then for other families that we went through the experience with, as I say in the book in an author's note, I only described people who had given me permission in ways that would identify them. I described a few other families who I couldn't be in contact with to ask for permission, but in those instances, I changed identifying details. I only wanted people to be able to be identified if I had their leave to write about them.
Heather, in writing such a personal book and something that obviously so raw for your family, but also ultimately so healing, there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in that, and a lot of soul bearing, and all of those ways of describing that. But what has been what reaction from readers has surprised you the most when folks have read this book, and how did that make you feel, knowing that your story had impacted someone so deeply?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give myself a break and interpret your question in the most generous sense. In that I'll answer the second part of it. What's been the most meaningful to me is when people have shared experiences from their own life in which they were also experiencing real upset, real uncertainty, real fear, or deep loss. One of all the many ways we can suffer because we're human and we love people and life is unpredictable. So when people have shared those stories of their own, their personal stories with me, and said that the book was meaningful to them, even though the circumstances, the story itself, the actual event or loss is radically different from what I'm talking about in the book, that's been really meaningful. And if you feel like you have kept someone company a little bit in their hurt, that's an honor. Like, it's in the same way that it's an honor, actually, like a genuine honor, if a friend who's hurting right in front of you will let you give them a hug. Like if someone says, yes, I accept your comfort and I will be vulnerable with you in this moment. That's a beautiful human action. And it's a deep honor to be allowed to put your arms around somebody. In that way, the person who's hurting is giving you a gift, and as much as you are them, right? It's this mutuality. And when you allow a writer into your mind, into your imagination, and allow that writer to console you, I've had that experience as a reader many, many times, or even allow a writer to make you laugh about something that's painful or make you see it in a new way, it's just magical, because something has happened between these two consciousnesses that are not in the same room together. So when people have that experience with something I've written, it's wow. I'm just, floored and delighted and grateful every time when people take the time to share that.
Heather, the book is fantastic. Happiness, a memoir, The Crooked Little Road to Semi-Ever After. I have thoroughly enjoyed it and thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. If people are moved by your story and want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you?
They can find me in all the regular haunts, Facebook and Twitter, and I have a website, heatherharpham.com, and Google away. Happy to see you in the ethereal airwaves.
Heather, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you, Hank, and thanks for the work you do bringing authors to readers.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
No use crying over spilled milk. Eliza hated that cliché. She'd grown up a cliché, her life a bowl of cherries, duck soup, easy as pie, child's play behind a white picket fence. Mother had been the Wyatt Earp of clichés, firing them off quick draw. A rotten apple spoils the barrel. Smile and the world smiles with you. Every dog has his day. Children should be seen and not heard. She believed them all, particularly this last. Eliza obliged, preferring to wander the streets of Wytheville, Virginia, on her own lonesome terms. The divorce left Laura a spinster librarian, and one false step on icy stairs left her an invalid as well. The accident happened on New Year's Eve, 1950. Laura had just locked the doors of Wytheville Public Library. We must make black-eyed peas tomorrow, Laura had been thinking, with turnip greens. That ensured a lucky new year, and if you swept some money over your threshold, a prosperous one, too. She loved those old Southern traditions. She looked both ways, checking for Negroes, but turned to heel on the icy marble of the stairs and fell into the bushes below, breaking the long bones in both legs. Eliza had taken advantage of her mother's absence. She'd lost her virginity that same night. She'd swept Ron Partridge over her threshold, initiating her own beloved tradition. She was nursing a hangover, giddily reliving the event. But around 8:30 she realized that her mother had not come down to breakfast. She checked her mother's bedroom, found it empty, took the bus down to the library, climbed the high stairs, knocked hard on the library doors, and heard a groan below. Laura lay under the William Penn barberry bushes, below the yellow-trimmed windows of the non-fiction section. Her white stockings ran Jezebel red with blood. Sweat and melted snow had soaked her blouse, and her gray forehead blazed. The broken bones didn't kill Laura Merrick. She lay in the hospital, wheezing, her legs mortared up in casts. She had few visitors after the first week. Her church group was glad to fret over a poor thing for a day or two, but they trickled away when Laura had the bad manners to linger. On Valentine's Day, as her mother slept, Eliza drew big, sloppy hearts on her casts. Laura harumphed when she woke and insisted on keeping her legs hidden beneath blankets afterwards. But in late March, something miraculous happened. Laura's self-control dropped. She ranted at nurses, spit at doctors, swore like a Navy pilot dropping F-bombs on Hiroshima. She had dementia, the doctors said. Eliza decided that her mother had just stopped believing her own bullshit. The spells continued over the next 2 weeks, and Eliza enjoyed her mother's company for the first time. They swapped bawdy jokes, ogled the handsome interns, and chattered like best girlfriends late into the evening. They had long conversations, and Laura spoke her own mind in her own words about things that mattered to her. It broke Eliza's heart when the prim, condescending librarian returned. Laura hardly acknowledged anything that had passed between them. The clichés returned. You can't have your cake and eat it too. A leopard doesn't change its spots. Nothing is certain except death and taxes. This last proved true. On April 15th, Laura Merrick marked her Bible with a tongue depressor, set it on her nightstand, leaned back against the headboard, and coughed blood down the front of her nightdress. Eliza found her that way, dead as the proverbial doornail, and yes, the blood was thicker than water, just as her mother had always said. Much thicker than water, in fact, perhaps as thick as molasses in January.